He said it in front of everyone. Kang Do-hyun, the most feared man in the Pacific underworld, looked Zariah Monroe straight in the eyes, in a room full of people wearing silk and diamonds, and he said it like she was furniture. Like she was a number on a spreadsheet he'd already closed. Seola brings power. You bring numbers. That's all you are. 3 years. She had given him 3 years of her mind, her freedom, her silence. 3 years of protecting an empire that was never hers, sleeping in a cage wrapped in luxury, telling herself that what she felt was real. And in 30 seconds, he erased all of it. Zariah didn't cry. Not in that room. Not in front of him. She walked away with her spine straight and something cold and permanent settling into the center of her chest. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible, stay with us. Subscribe to the channels so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city and country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and don't look away, because what Zariah does next will change everything. The night Zariah Monroe's entire life collapsed, she was wearing a dress that cost more than her first car. It was an emerald green Givenchy gown, backless, perfectly fitted, that had appeared inside her walk-in closet 3 days before the gala without any note attached. There was never a note. That was how Do-hyun operated. Things simply appeared. The implication was always the same. I decided you needed this. I decided this for you. Accept it. She had accepted it. She'd accepted all of it, for longer than she was proud of. Zariah stood in the marble bathroom of Do-hyun's penthouse, on the 42nd floor of the Mujin Tower in downtown Seattle, pressing her fingertips against the cold sink basin, studying her own reflection like she was looking at a stranger. The woman staring back at her had perfect makeup, flawless skin under gallery lighting, cheekbones that caught the light just right. She looked expensive. She looked composed. She looked like a woman with nowhere to run. Her phone buzzed once. A text from Jaemin Do-hyun's lieutenant, her shadow, her jailer dressed up like a professional assistant. Car leaves in 8 minutes. She put the phone face down and kept her eyes on her own reflection. 3 years. She had been here for 3 years. She still remembered the morning they brought her in. She'd been 30 years old, sharpest forensic accountant at Vantage Financial Group in Seattle, and she had made the catastrophic mistake of being good at her job. She'd found the discrepancies buried inside what looked like a routine audit of Pacific West Shipping and Import LLC, a legitimate-looking company with legitimate-looking financials, except for the microscopic anomalies hiding inside transfer records, subsidiary shells, and routing numbers that dead-ended in jurisdictions that did not ask questions. She had taken her findings to her supervisor, David Holt, with the kind of quiet, professional certainty she'd built her reputation on. David Holt had listened to every word. He'd nodded slowly. He'd told her she'd done excellent work and that he'd personally escalate it to compliance leadership that afternoon. 48 hours later, David Holt was simply gone. No resignation, no notice. His personal items were cleared out of his office overnight, and when she asked HR, they looked at her with eyes that said, "Stop asking." The next morning, 2 men in dark suits had appeared at her apartment door at 7A. They weren't rude. They weren't threatening, not in any way she could point to. They simply told her that a business associate of Vantage's parent company had requested a meeting, and that she had been specifically recommended. She'd asked if she had a choice. The taller man had smiled gently and held the car door open. Kang Do-hyun had been standing at floor-to-ceiling windows when she was brought into the penthouse. He'd had his back to her, looking out over Elliott Bay. He was 40 years old, Korean-American, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from relaxation. It came from absolute confidence that nothing in the room could threaten him. When he turned, she expected arrogance. She got something more unsettling, a calm, evaluating intelligence that swept over her and categorized everything it found in about 4 seconds. He had offered her coffee. She'd said no. He'd poured her a cup anyway and set it on the table in front of her chair. "You're very good," he'd said simply. David Holt wasn't. "You are." He'd sat across from her and opened a folder she recognized immediately her work. Her findings, the exact discrepancies she had documented. "The question is what we do about that." She'd asked him what the options were. He'd told her there were two. She had known, even in that first conversation, that the second option was not something she would survive. She hadn't even made him say it aloud. She'd picked up the coffee, which she didn't want, and taken a sip she didn't taste, and she'd said, "What would the work involve?" Something in his expression had shifted, not warmth, exactly. Recognition, like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked. And just like that, Zariah Monroe's old life ended, and this one began. The gala was held in the Grand Meridian Ballroom, one of Seattle's legacy hotels that still knew how to make wealth feel old and inevitable. Do-hyun moved through the room with the particular ease of a man who understood that real power didn't announce itself, it waited to be acknowledged. People moved slightly when he walked past. Not obviously, not in the way anyone would notice unless they were watching for it, but they moved. They adjusted. Zariah had learned to watch for it. She stayed at the edge of conversations the way she always did at these events, close enough to be seen as part of his world, far enough to be clearly decorative rather than functional. That was the unspoken arrangement. She was here. She was presentable. She understood things she was not supposed to understand, and she kept her mouth closed about all of it. She was good at keeping her mouth closed. What she was less good at, what 3 years of proximity had done to her, without her permission, was the ache. The stupid, inconvenient, humiliating ache that had settled into her chest sometime around month 14 and refused to leave. She wasn't naive. She knew what Do-hyun was. She knew what he was capable of, what he had ordered, what ran underneath the legitimate businesses and charitable donations and political connections. She had seen the ledgers. She had built some of those ledgers. She knew exactly how many edges this man had and how sharp every single one of them was. And still, there had been a Tuesday night in February, 6 months ago, when a negotiation had gone sideways, and Do-hyun had been up until 3 in the morning dealing with the fallout, and she'd still been at her desk at 2 a.m. running contingency numbers, and he'd come in quietly and set a cup of green tea beside her keyboard without a word and gone to sit on the couch across the room and just been there. Not demanding anything, not performing, just present. She'd thought about that night more times than she could count. She needed to stop thinking about that night. She was reaching for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray when she heard the room shift, that subtle collective reorientation that meant someone significant had entered. Turned. The woman was extraordinary. That was the honest word for it. Yoon Seola was perhaps 35, Korean, with the kind of composed, immaculate beauty that came from generations of people who had never had to apologize for taking up space. She wore white, a deliberate choice. Zariah thought immediately, and she moved through the room like she'd already decided she owned it. The men around Do-hyun straightened almost imperceptibly. Jae-min appeared at Zariah's elbow from nowhere, which meant Do-hyun had told him to. "Mr. Kang has a business introduction to manage," Jae-min said quietly. "He asks that you enjoy the evening. He asks that you stay out of the way." Zariah watched Do-hyun walk toward Seola. She watched the way he tilted his head slightly when he reached her, not deference, exactly, but the closest thing to it she had ever seen from him. She watched Seola's hand rest briefly on his arm, and the way he did not move away. She had been telling herself for 3 years that she was surviving. She understood now, watching this, that she had been doing something much more dangerous than surviving. She had been hoping. Sipersen. She found him an hour later in the hotel corridor, outside the private meeting rooms, after introductions were finished and the formal portion of the evening had dissolved into cocktails and careful conversations. She had not planned to do this tonight. She had planned to do what she always did: absorb the information, file it, survive the evening, return to the penthouse, and lock whatever she was feeling into the part of herself where she kept things that couldn't be fixed. But she was tired. 3 years of tired. And the ache in her chest had become something she could not breathe around. Do-hyun. He turned. Something crossed his face when he saw her expression, a flicker of something she couldn't read, gone before she could name it. Zariah. His voice was completely neutral. "You should be—" "I need to say something." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd spent 3 years becoming steady under pressure. Some skills had unexpected applications, and I need you to actually listen. Not she caught herself before she said, not manage me, not just hear it. Pause. He studied her face. Say it, he said. And because she was exhausted, because she had been inside this gilded trap for 3 years, and she didn't have anything left to protect except the truth, she said it plainly. She told him that something had changed for her, somewhere along the way. That she knew what it was, and she knew it was probably the worst idea she'd ever had, and she was not asking him for anything except honesty. She told him that she needed to know if she was reading what was between them correctly, or if she had built a story in her head out of Tuesday nights and green tea, and the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She told him she needed to know where she stood. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. They felt very long. Do-hyun looked at her. His expression had not changed. That stillness she had once found so compelling now felt like a door closing. You stand where you've always stood, he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely precise. Seola Yoon is the daughter of Chairman Yoon Byung-soo. A marriage between our families gives the Mujin Syndicate control of 3 Pacific shipping corridors worth more than $200 million annually. That's what she represents. He paused. Just one beat. Just enough. You manage my finances, Zariah. You're very good at it. That's what you represent. She held his gaze. So I'm an asset, she said. An essential one. That's a kind way to say I mean nothing. He didn't correct her. She nodded once, very slowly. Something in her chest, that thing she'd been carrying for over a year, that inconvenient, humiliating hope didn't shatter. It didn't crumble dramatically. It just went quiet. Like a fire that runs out of oxygen and simply stops. Thank you for being honest, she said. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Do-hyun watched her go. He did not call after her. Jaemin drove her back to the penthouse at 11:30. She sat in the back seat and looked out the rain-streaked window at the lights of Seattle going past, and she did not say a single word. Jaemin, who had been Do-hyun's shadow for 12 years, and Zariah's unofficial keeper for 3 of them, glanced at her twice in the rearview mirror and then kept his eyes on the road. He was perceptive enough to know when to leave things alone. In the elevator, riding up 42 floors in silence, Zariah did the thing she had trained herself to do whenever the situation required it. She stopped feeling and started calculating. By the time the elevator doors opened into the penthouse foyer, she had a very clear and precise thought sitting in the front of her mind, like a clean line of code. I am leaving this place. Not someday. Not when conditions improved, or when she found the right opening, or when she'd gathered enough resources. She was leaving, and the only question now was how. She walked to the main bedroom, her bedroom. Though it had always felt like a room, she was merely permitted to sleep in and sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed in her expensive dress and her perfect makeup and her borrowed life. Laugh. And she thought. She thought about what she knew, which was, as it turned out, a great deal. Speens. She thought about the financial infrastructure she had spent 3 years building and maintaining and protecting, the shell companies, the offshore routing structures, the transfer mechanisms, the compliant accounts, the legitimate front businesses with their carefully managed tax profiles. She thought about the access code she used daily, the security protocols she had quietly memorized out of the professional habit of someone who understood that information was the only currency that didn't depreciate. She thought about the 411 separate occasions over the past 2 years when she had transferred funds through layered accounts, each transfer processed by her personally, each one requiring her to approve routing instructions that passed through systems she knew intimately. She thought about something else, something she had begun doing very quietly, very carefully, about 2 years ago, something she had never told anyone, never documented anywhere that could be found, never allowed herself to think about directly, for longer than a few seconds at a time, because thinking about it felt too much like hope, and hope, she had learned, was expensive. She had been moving money, not stealing, not obviously. Nothing that would appear in any audit as a discrepancy. She was too good for that. She knew where the eyes were. She knew what the thresholds were. She knew how to make small things disappear inside large numbers. She had been diverting microscopic fractions that fell beneath every detection threshold, fractions that aggregated over 24 months into something substantial, into a chain of offshore entities she had constructed under identities she had also constructed, identities that led nowhere if anyone tried to trace them. She had never used a single dollar of it. She had also memorized everything else she might need: security override sequences, service access routes, administrative codes for the building's secondary systems, corporate structure maps she could reconstruct from memory, account locations and access protocols she had committed to recall in the same way she had always memorized numbers effortlessly, permanently, as naturally as breathing. She hadn't known, when she'd started, that she was building an exit. She'd told herself she was just paying attention, being thorough, preserving information the way a careful professional always did. Sitting on this edge of that bed, in the green Givenchy dress, Zariah admitted to herself for the first time that she had always known. She had been building this exit for 2 years. She just hadn't been ready to use it. She reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace Do-hyun had placed around her throat 18 months ago, on a wordless evening when he'd come home late, and set it on the table beside her laptop without explanation. She'd worn it most days since. She wasn't sure why. She set it on the nightstand and looked at it for a moment. Then she stood up, changed into dark clothes, and went to her desk. She had work to do. Not Do-hyun's work, not the Mujin Syndicate's work. Hers. She spent 22 days getting everything in order. Not because she needed 22 days, she could have been ready in a week. But Do-hyun was in and out of the penthouse, unpredictably in the weeks after the gala, and she had learned over 3 years that the only thing more dangerous than making a mistake in his world was making a mistake at the wrong moment. She needed a window. She needed 48 hours, minimum, with his attention pointed somewhere other than Seattle. She waited. She was patient. She had learned patience, the same way she had learned everything else in this penthouse, under conditions that didn't give her the option of being anything else. She was also, in those 22 days, completely and perfectly professional. She showed up to every meeting. She ran every number. She answered every question. She gave Do-hyun's operation everything it needed, and she gave him nothing, no indication, no shift in her demeanor, no conversation that lasted longer than necessary. She had always been controlled. Now she just had a direction for it. If Do-hyun noticed any change in her, he gave no sign. He was occupied with Seola's arrival in Seattle, with the political architecture of the proposed merger, with the men and money moving around his empire as the Yoon family alliance began to take shape. Zariah processed some of those financial arrangements herself, with her usual precision, without comment. On the 23rd day, Do-hyun told Jaemin he was flying to Vancouver for 48 hours to finalize terms with a Canadian supplier he'd been negotiating with for months. He told Zariah to have preliminary projections on the Yoon integration ready for his return. She said she would. He left at 6 in the evening. At 2 in the morning, Zariah picked up the diamond necklace from her nightstand, walked to the main study, and set it on top of the financial ledger she'd been working from most recently. She took a pen and wrote 3 words across the top sheet. I mean nothing. She left the pen beside the ledger and walked out of the study. She had already packed nothing. Everything Do-hyun had provided her: the clothes, the jewelry, the devices, the furniture, the life she left behind completely. She took only what she had acquired through her own means. In the world she had been building in the dark, a prepaid device registered to an identity that did not exist, access credentials to accounts that could not be traced, and enough in liquid form to begin. She used a security override she had memorized 14 months ago to reach the maintenance elevator that serviced the building's administrative systems. It did not appear on the primary surveillance grid. She had noticed that on her 3rd week in the building. She had never forgotten it. In the underground maintenance tunnels beneath the building, she changed her coat, her shoes, her appearance. By the time she emerged onto a service street 6 blocks from Mujin Tower, Zariah Monroe no longer looked like the woman who lived on the 42nd floor. The rain was still coming down. She walked into it without hesitating. She didn't look back at the tower. There was nothing back there worth looking at. But as she moved through the wet Seattle night, a thought moved through her with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything she had a clean name for, the recognition that the man she was leaving behind was going to realize what she'd done, and that when he did, something was going to break loose in him. She had lived close enough to Kang Do-hyun for 3 years to understand one thing about him that very few people survived long enough to learn. He did not handle losing well. She walked faster. The rain swallowed the sound of her footsteps. And somewhere above her in the glittering tower, the diamond necklace lay on a ledger in an empty study waiting for morning. Do-hyun's plane landed at SeaTac at 6:14 in the morning, 11 hours ahead of schedule. The Vancouver negotiation had collapsed. Not dramatically, nothing in Do-hyun's world collapsed dramatically, because he did not permit dramatic collapses. He permitted controlled failures that could be managed and rebuilt. But the Canadian supplier had come to the table with conditions that weren't conditions so much as they were an attempt at extortion. And Do-hyun had looked at the man across a hotel conference table at 9 p.m. and said 4 words were done, here, then, and walked out while his people were still gathering their folders. He did not negotiate with people who mistook his patience for weakness. Jae-min had the car waiting on the tarmac. He'd been awake since 3 a.m. Do-hyun had called him from the airport 45 minutes before boarding, and Jae-min had learned a long time ago that calls at 3 a.m. did not get answered with anything less than complete alertness. In the car, Do-hyun sat in the back and looked out the window and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Jae-min drove and kept his own silence, which was one of the things that had kept him alive and employed for 12 years. "How were things last night?" Do-hyun said finally. "Not a question, really." A door being opened. "Quiet," Jae-min said. "Ms. Monroe was working late. I checked in at midnight. She said she didn't need anything." Do-hyun nodded once and went back to looking out the window. He didn't think about Zariah specifically during the drive. He thought about the Vancouver failure and the timeline adjustments it required, and the message it might send to certain people if the word got out that Kang Do-hyun had walked away from a negotiation table. He thought about Seol-ah and the Yoon family timeline and whether the shipping corridor integration was proceeding cleanly. He thought about 3 different conversations he needed to have before noon. He was not thinking about Zariah when the elevator opened into the penthouse foyer at 6:58 in the morning, and the quality of the air inside the apartment told him immediately, before he'd taken 3 steps, that something was wrong. Couldn't have explained it precisely. It was not a smell, not a sound, not any single observable thing. It was the particular kind of stillness that a space acquires when it has been empty for hours, a different quality than the stillness of someone sleeping, someone working quietly, someone simply being present in another room. He had been in enough places where violence had happened to recognize the specific texture of a room that had been recently abandoned. He stood in the foyer for 2 seconds. Then he walked directly to the study. The ledger was open on the desk. The diamond necklace lay across the top of it, catching the low morning light. He could read the 3 words on the paper from 4 feet away. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Jae-min appeared in the doorway behind him. Do-hyun heard him see it, heard the half-second catch in his breathing. "Get me the building surveillance," Do-hyun said. His voice was completely level. "Every exit, every camera from midnight back." Yes, Jae-min was already on his phone. Do-hyun reached out and picked up the necklace. He held it for a moment, not with any visible emotion, just held it, the way he held things he was assessing. Then he set it back down on the ledger exactly where it had been. He did not touch the paper. The surveillance footage took 40 minutes to compile and review. By 7:45, Do-hyun knew 3 things. Zariah had left through the maintenance elevator. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, she had changed her appearance in the service corridor below, and she had exited onto a street not covered by the building's primary camera grid. After that, she was simply gone. No image, no trace. No direction. Do-hyun sat at his desk and looked at the last frame of footage, a woman in a dark coat, hood up, walking away from the camera angle into rain, and he did not move for a full minute. Jaemin waited. She planned this, Do-hyun said. Yes. She knew about the maintenance elevator. She's been in this building for 3 years. She knows it better than most of my men. A pause. Who helped her, Do-hyun said. We don't know yet. Find out. He looked up from the screen. And find her. She couldn't have gone far in one night on foot. She had resources find where they came from. Financial trail, identity documentation, transportation. She didn't build this overnight, Jaemin. She built it while she was sitting in this apartment, and that means there are threads. Pull them. I'll start immediately. Do-hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And I want to know who in my organization knew about this and said nothing. Jaemin left without another word. Do-hyun turned back to the empty desk. The necklace sat on the ledger. The 3 words stared up at him, written in Zariah's precise, controlled handwriting. I mean nothing. Something moved through him that he did not immediately classify. It wasn't quite what he would have called anger. It was sharper than that and less clean. He picked up his phone and began making calls, and by the time the city outside his windows was fully awake, the machinery of the Mujin Syndicate had been redirected toward a single objective. By noon, the first assumption had taken hold. Zariah had been taken. It was a logical assumption. She had been inside Do-hyun's world for 3 years. She knew things. She had value as leverage, value as intelligence, value as a message. The Daesungzi network out of Portland had been making moves along the coast for the past 4 months. The Hwan brothers in Tacoma had been quietly expanding their territory. Any number of people had reasons to want something from Kang Do-hyun, and the woman who managed his finances was an extraordinarily precise way to get his attention. Do-hyun moved on this assumption with the speed and precision that had built his empire. By 2 in the afternoon, he had men at every location associated with Daesung. By 4, he had personally called Song Min-jun head of the Daesung network, and the conversation had been short and exceptionally clear. By evening, 3 separate businesses with Hwan family connections had experienced significant structural problems. The Pacific underworld, which had been observing a fragile peace for 14 months, began to tremble, and Zariah Monroe was still gone. It was Jaemin who found the thread on the 3rd day. He came into the study at 7 in the evening with a tablet, and the particular careful expression he wore when he was about to deliver information he knew would not be received well. The financial audit is done, he said. Do-hyun looked up from the negotiation documents he'd been pretending to read for the past hour. She moved money, Jaemin said. He set the tablet on the desk and turned it so Do-hyun could see the screen. Not much at once. Never enough to trigger anything. But consistently, over approximately 24 months, she diverted fractions from larger transfers into a chain of offshore entities. We've been able to identify 6 of the shells so far, all established under identities that don't trace back to any real person we can find. Do-hyun looked at the screen, at the numbers, at the dates, at the architecture of it, which was even now, even under these circumstances, genuinely elegant. How much total? He said. Jaemin told him. It was enough to disappear on. Enough to build a new life on. Not a fortune by his standards, but substantial, the kind of number that required intelligence and patience and a very long view. She built this herself, Do-hyun said. It was not quite a question. It has her methodology. The structure is hers. Nobody helped her with the construction. She did this alone over 2 years. The silence in the room had a different quality than it had before. Nobody took her, Do-hyun said. No, she left. Yes. He sat back in his chair. His face was still that characteristic, controlled stillness. But behind his eyes, something was happening that Jaemin recognized from 12 years of proximity, something he had only seen a handful of times. And each of those times had ended badly for whoever had caused it. She was sitting in this apartment, Do-hyun said slowly, building an exit. For 2 years, while I trusted her with my entire financial infrastructure. A pause. And I didn't see it. Jaemin said nothing. Pull back the operations against Daesung and the Hwans, Do-hyun said. His voice was very quiet now. Quieter was worse with him. Jamin had always known that. Issue corrections. Tell them it was a misunderstanding about an internal personnel matter. That will cost us credibility. I know what it will cost. He stood up. Then redirect everything. Every contact, every resource, every favor I'm owed. I want her found, Jamin. Not harmed, not touched, but found and brought back. His eyes were steady and very dark. And when you find the thread on the identity documentation, whoever helped her build those covers, I want that person in front of me. Jamin nodded carefully. She couldn't have built the identities alone, Doyun continued. The financial architecture, yes, that's her. But the documentation, the cover legends, she needed someone on the outside for that. Find them. They're the thread she left that she doesn't know about yet. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the harbor. 2 years, he said, more to himself than to Jamin. She sat here for 2 years and planned every detail. And she did it perfectly. Another pause. Almost. From a rented cottage on the Oregon coast, 12 hours south of Seattle, Zariah watched the news. She had chosen the cottage with the same methodical care she'd applied to every step of her exit. It was registered to a name that didn't exist, paid for in cash, routed through a third party, isolated enough that no casual traffic would pass its driveway, but not so isolated that her presence would be notable in the small coastal community. She had arrived at dawn on her second day of travel, after changing transportation 3 times and her appearance twice, and she had sat at the kitchen table and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. The breathing didn't last long. By day 3, she was watching reports of violence filtering. Out of Seattle's underworld, businesses disrupted. Negotiations collapsed. The careful ecosystem of criminal coexistence visibly destabilizing. She recognized the signature. She had seen Do-hyun mobilize like this before, the focused application of overwhelming pressure, but always toward an external target. She had never seen it turned inward, applied to his own world. He thought someone had taken her. She watched the reports and felt something complicated move through her, not satisfaction, not guilt exactly. More like the recognition of a consequence she had known was coming and had still not been entirely prepared for the reality of. She also felt something else, something she was angry at herself for feeling, the fact that the most powerful criminal organization on the Pacific coast was currently tearing itself apart over her absence meant, on some level she could not entirely deny, that she had never quite been nothing. She shut that thought down hard. She was better than that. On day 4, she began the next phase. She had a secure laptop preloaded, carefully built, part of what she'd prepared, and she used it to check on the offshore structures she'd built. Everything intact. She moved funds through 2 additional layers, further obscuring the trail, and set up redundant access protocols. Then she began mapping what she would need for the long term: new documentation, new location, new professional infrastructure. She worked cleanly and efficiently, and she did not let herself think about the 3 words she'd left on that ledger. She had said what she needed to say. She was done explaining herself to people who valued her in the transactional and not the human sense. She was done. On day 6, she saw the news shift. The violence against external targets began to quiet. The Daesung situation, which had been escalating, suddenly de-escalated. She recognized that shift, too. It meant information had changed. It meant someone's inside Do-hyun's machine had figured out what she already knew, that nobody had taken her. She closed her laptop and sat very still at the kitchen table. She had a week, maybe less, before Do-hyun redirected those resources toward actually finding her. She needed to be further away. She needed to be harder to track. And she needed to start thinking about the long play, not just escape, but permanence. She began packing. Jamin found the identity specialist on day 9. His name was Calvin Marsh, and he operated out of Portland, and he was one of perhaps 6 people on the coast capable of building the kind of documentation cover that Zariah had used. Jamin's people had worked through the list methodically, which was how Jamin did everything, and Calvin Marsh had the particular misfortune of being 3rd on that list. When Jamin's men brought him in, not roughly, Because Du Yun had been very specific about, not roughly, Calvin Marsh was a 53-year-old former government document specialist who had been running his alternative business for 11 years without ever attracting serious attention from anyone with the resources to come find him. He was not a hard man to break. He wasn't soft. Exactly, he'd dealt with difficult people before, but Jae-min had been sitting across from difficult people his entire adult life. And he knew immediately that Calvin Marsh would tell him what he needed to know within 20 minutes. It took 15. Calvin told him that a woman matching Zariah's description had approached him indirectly through a referral chain 18 months ago. He had built her 3 identity packages, full documentation, backstories, the works good enough to pass standard law enforcement checks. He had been paid well and had asked no questions, as was his policy. He had no idea where she was now. He gave Jae-min everything he had. The aliases, the documentation structure, the cover legends. Jae-min called Do Yoon from the parking structure outside the building where Calvin Marsh was being held. "We have the aliases," he said. "All of them? 3 packages. Names, documentation details, the entire structure of each cover." A pause on the line. "Then how long before we can run them?" "We can have our people at transport hubs and border crossings within 6 hours. If she uses any of these identities for travel, we'll flag her." "Do it." Another pause. "Jae-min." "Yes, she's been moving. She wouldn't have stayed on the coast. She understood the risk window." "Where would she go?" Jae-min thought about it. He had spent 3 years watching Zariah Monroe navigate a situation most people wouldn't have survived. He knew how she thought, not perfectly, but well enough. "East," he said. "She'd go east, put distance between herself and your established network on the coast. Somewhere urban enough to disappear into, but somewhere with infrastructure she can use. Nevada, Arizona, or she pushes to Chicago. That's what I'd guess." "Start in Nevada," Du Yoon said. "She'd stop somewhere to work before she moves further. She wouldn't just run, she'd need to set up, access her accounts, build the next stage. She'd find a room somewhere and work before she moved on." He knew this because he knew her. The recognition of it sat in his chest like something he didn't have a name for. She would not be able to resist starting the next phase before she felt safe. He was right, because after 3 years he understood how her mind worked, the same way she understood his. He was beginning to realize the specific nature of the problem. Zariah was in the motel room outside Henderson, Nevada, when she understood that she had made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one, not yet. But she had pushed the timeline on the next phase. She'd been unable to stop herself from beginning to dismantle certain financial structures remotely, accessing locked accounts and rerouting capital in ways that would take days to notice, but would begin doing real damage to Do Hyun's operational liquidity once they did. She had told herself she was simply being thorough. She had told herself she was protecting herself. She had also told herself she wasn't doing it partly out of anger, which was a lie. The motel was anonymous and adequately miserable: thin carpet, bad lighting, the low-level hum of the ice machine, 3 doors down. She had the laptop open, and a second device beside it, serving as a secure hotspot, and she had been working for 6 hours when she heard the car. Not any car. The specific sound of more than one car, 2, maybe 3, pulling into the motel lot and stopping in a pattern that didn't match casual arrival. She heard it through the thin walls and the part of her brain that had been tuned by 3 years of living inside a criminal organization. Recognized the pattern before she consciously understood what she was recognizing. She was on her feet in 2 seconds. The laptop was encrypted, useless to anyone without her credentials. She grabbed the secondary device, killed the room's overhead light, and moved to the bathroom. She heard boots on the concrete outside. Measured, deliberate. Not running yet. They didn't know exactly which room. She had perhaps 45 seconds. The bathroom window was narrow and high. She had noted it when she checked in, the same way she noted all the exits in every room she'd occupied for the past 3 years, a habit so ingrained it had become reflexive. She stood on the toilet tank, got her hands on the frame, and pushed. The window had been painted over. Of course it had. She heard a knock on her room door, official sounding. calibrated to make someone open it. She hit the painted frame with the heel of her palm. Once. Twice. It gave on the third strike and swung outward, and she went through it headfirst, catching herself on the outer wall, dropping 6 feet into the narrow gap between the motel building and the perimeter fence. She heard the room door going in behind her. She was already moving. The fence was chain link, maybe 6 feet. She was over it in 8 seconds, dropping into a narrow drainage channel on the other side. And then she was running, not panicked, because panic was a luxury she had trained herself out of running, with the calculated, managed urgency of someone who has already thought about what comes after the fence. She had parked a secondary vehicle, a beat-up Honda she'd acquired through a private sale for cash, registered to one of her cover identities 4 blocks from the motel. She'd done this as a standard protocol on every stop. She hadn't known she would need it tonight. She was very glad she'd done it anyway. She got to the Honda with her lungs burning and her hands shaking and her mind already 3 steps ahead. Jae-min's voice, clear as anything, moved through her memory. Mr. Kang is very thorough. He'd said that to her once, in the first month, when she'd asked about something she'd seen in the security rotation. It had sounded like a warning then. It sounded like a promise now. They had her aliases. That was the only explanation. Calvin. It had to be Calvin she had known. When she built this, that Calvin Marsh was the one thread she couldn't fully control, the one piece of her infrastructure that existed in another person's memory. She drove south for 40 minutes, then east, then stopped at an all-night gas station and used the bathroom to change her hair color with a kit she'd been carrying since Seattle and her appearance well enough to make the aliases unreliable. Anyone was running face recognition at transport hubs. Then she got back in the car and drove. She drove through the Nevada night with the windows down and the desert air coming in cold and flat, and she thought about Calvin Marsh, and hoped he was all right, and knew with the realistic part of her mind that all right was probably relative. And she drove and thought, and did not stop doing either. She needed to go to ground, somewhere they hadn't looked yet. Somewhere with the infrastructure she needed. Chicago. She had avoided Chicago specifically because she knew Jae-min was smart enough to think of it. But the aliases were burned, which changed the calculation. It didn't matter anymore whether they predicted her destination if she was building a new identity from scratch. And Chicago had what she needed: space, anonymity, commercial infrastructure, and a financial district large enough to hide the kind of activity she was planning. Because Zariah Monroe had been running for 9 days, and she was tired of running. The running part was almost over. What came next would require her to stop moving and start fighting, and fighting was something she was very specifically and technically prepared to do. She had spent 2 years building herself a weapon. She had barely started using it. By the time gray morning light began finding the flat edge of the horizon ahead of her, she had the next phase mapped out with the kind of cold, methodical clarity that Do-hyun had once looked at across a desk and called very good. He had no idea how good. She was about to show him. Honda's tires hummed on the interstate, and the miles fell behind her, and somewhere north and west of her, in a glass penthouse above Seattle, a man who had never in his adult life failed to recover something he had decided to keep was beginning to understand, for the first time, what it felt like to reach for something and find only air. She did not feel sorry for him. She pressed the accelerator and drove east into the morning, and the plan took shape in her mind with every mile, clean and precise and absolutely without mercy, because Zariah Monroe had learned mercy from a man who didn't practice it. And she was done with lessons that only went one direction. She reached Chicago on the 4th day of driving, having stopped only when her body refused to continue 2 hours in a rest stop parking lot in Iowa with the seat reclined and both doors locked. A kind of sleep that was more like unconsciousness than rest, the kind that leaves you more aware of how tired you are when you wake up than before you closed your eyes. The city came up slowly through flat Midwestern gray, first the smear of light pollution on the horizon, then the outer suburbs bleeding into industrial corridors, then the lakefront, appearing on her right as she pushed into the city proper. Lake Michigan, sitting out there in the November cold like something enormous and indifferent. She had a location already picked. Not from memory, she had researched it from the motel in Henderson before everything went wrong. A commercial loft space in the Pilsen neighborhood, listed as available for short-term lease through a property management company that did not ask many questions if the first and last months were paid in advance and in cash. She had a cover identity for the lease, not one of the 3 Calvin had built, which were compromised, but a 4th one she had constructed herself over many months. Simpler and less polished than Calvin's work, but built entirely inside her own infrastructure. No external thread for anyone to pull. She had not told Calvin about the 4th identity. She had learned, working inside Do-Hyun's organization, that every system has a failsafe, and the failsafe should always be the thing you build alone, in the dark, that nobody else knows exists. The loft was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, exposed brick and concrete floors and windows that faced a narrow alley on one side and a used auto parts business on the other. It was cold when she first walked through it. The heat had been off for weeks, and it smelled like industrial solvent and old wood, and the particular emptiness of a space that hadn't held a living person in a long time. She stood in the middle of the bare concrete floor, with her jacket zipped to her chin, and looked around and thought, "This will do." She paid cash. She signed the lease under the 4th identity. She bought a space heater from a hardware store 6 blocks away and carried it up the stairs herself. Then she got to work. The equipment took 2 days to assemble. She was cautious about it, purchasing components from different vendors, across different neighborhoods, paying cash for everything, never buying enough at one location to seem like someone building a system. A laptop here, a router there, signal equipment from an electronic surplus place in Wicker Park, where the owner barely looked up from his phone. She built a secure local network with multiple layers of obfuscation, tested it thoroughly, and then sat down in front of it on the morning of her 3rd day in Chicago and began dismantling Kang Do-Hyun's empire. Not all of it. Not yet. She was methodical about this, the same way she was methodical about everything she started with the structures she understood most intimately, the ones she had built herself. The financial architecture she could navigate from memory because she had designed every corridor and placed every door. She moved money away from operational accounts. She triggered compliance flags around 3 legitimate upfront businesses by introducing anomalies that would attract regulatory attention without being obviously artificial. She disrupted a series of offshore payment schedules that financed 2 of Do-Hyun's most active distribution networks. She did all of this quietly, precisely, and with the focused calm of someone who has finally, after weeks of running, gotten to do what they are actually best at. The damage she was causing would not be immediately visible. That was intentional. She wanted it to spread slowly, like water, finding its way through a foundation. By the time Do-Hyun's people identified the source, the rot would already be structural. She worked 12-hour days. She ate badly convenient store food, a rotation of the same for cheap items, because she didn't want to spend time in restaurants where faces were remembered. She slept on a sleeping bag on the concrete floor because she hadn't bought a bed and didn't plan to be here long enough to need one. She was cold most of the time, despite the space heater, which was doing its best and losing. On the 6th station Chicago, she received confirmation through a monitored channel that the regulatory scrutiny around 2 of Do-Hyun's front companies had escalated from automated flag to active review. She allowed herself to feel something approximating satisfaction about that, briefly, and then moved on to the next target. On the 8th day, she found the anomaly. She had been running a routine check on the offshore chain she'd built 2 years ago, verifying that her structures remained intact, that nothing had been touched or traced, when she noticed something in the access logs that didn't belong. A read query, not a write, which meant someone had looked at the architecture without moving anything. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing that only someone built the structure because you had to know exactly what the logs were supposed to look like in order to recognize that this log looked slightly different. She stared at it for a long time. Then she began tracing it backward. It took 4 hours. The trace was layered. Someone had used 3 proxy hops and a timing obfuscation method that she recognized as professional grade, not the work of a casual hacker or even a competent one. This was intelligence contractor level. This was someone who did this for a living and was very good at it. The trace dead-ended at a routing node in Singapore. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. Do-hyun had found her offshore architecture. Not the funds, she'd moved those twice since Henderson, and they were behind 2 more layers now, but the structure itself, the framework she'd spent 2 years building. The fact that he'd found it without moving anything meant one of 2 things. Either he didn't yet have access credentials and was mapping before he made a move, or he was being very careful not to spook her. She thought about which of those was more likely, given what she knew about Do-hyun. She got back on the keyboard and started building additional walls. She worked until 3 in the morning without stopping, rerouting, re-encrypting, adding layers, changing access protocols. Her back ached, her eyes burned, the space heater clicked and hummed. Somewhere outside Chicago went about its late-night business without knowing or caring that a woman in an empty loft was engaged in a financial war that most people in this city didn't know was possible. When she finally stopped, she sat in the glow of the screen and thought carefully about what the access log meant. It meant they were closer than she'd calculated. It meant the timeline had to accelerate. She had been in Chicago for 11 days when Marcus Webb called her. Marcus was the one person she had told about Chicago, not her specific location, just the city, just enough so that he could reach her if he needed to. Marcus had been her closest friend from her previous life, a forensic IT specialist she'd worked alongside at Vantage Financial before her world had contracted into the penthouse on the 42nd floor. He'd spent 3 years not knowing exactly where she was or what had happened to her, accepting the story her captors had carefully constructed about a personal crisis and a leave of absence and a relocation. And he had been the first person she'd contacted after leaving Seattle because he was the only person in her previous life she'd trusted without reservation. He answered on the second ring. "You need to see something," he said immediately. No greeting. She had told him, when she first contacted him, to skip the normal human opening rituals if he was calling with something urgent, and he had agreed because Marcus was practical in ways she had always valued. "What is it?" "Someone ran your name through 4 different federal database systems in the past 72 hours. Not just your current name, your old name, Zariah Monroe. Employment records, financial history, the full profile." She felt something cold settle into her stomach. Which agencies? That's the thing, a pause. 2 of them track back to legitimate federal financial crime units. That I expected. That makes sense, given what you're doing to those front companies. But the other 2. He stopped. Marcus. The other 2 trace to request pathways I've seen before, Zariah. Contractors. Private intelligence contractors who work for people who are not the government. She understood immediately. He's using his own people to run federal queries. Through intermediaries with legitimate access. Yeah. Which means he has either current or former federal employees on his payroll who can run names without triggering audit flags. And that means he knows I'm working. He knows the regulatory action on the front companies came from someone with inside financial knowledge. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. He's not just looking for me geographically anymore. He's trying to understand what I'm doing. There's something else. Marcus's voice change got quieter, which was worse. The identity specialist you used. Calvin Marsh. I did some checking after you mentioned him. What about him? He's been released. Do-hyun's people let him go 2 days after they picked him up. She didn't say anything for a moment. That's not mercy, she said. No, I don't think it is either. She thought about it quickly, and the conclusion came fast and cold, and she did not like what it meant. Calvin Marsh had been released because he was more useful free than held. Because a man who knew he'd been questioned by Kang Do-hyun's people, who was scared and compromised, who understood exactly what kind of trouble he was in, was a man who might do exactly what scared. Compromised people did reach out to anyone who could help him, including the woman he'd built identity packages for, in the desperate hope that she might be willing to trade his safety for something she had. He's bait, she said. Or a censor, Marcus said. Release him, watch his communications, wait for him to reach out to you or for you to reach out to him. Either way, you're connected to him, and if they're monitoring. Did he contact me? She already knew the answer from the way Marcus had said it, but she needed to hear it. He sent you a message through the emergency protocol you set up. The secure drop. 48 hours ago. She closed her eyes. The secure drop, she hadn't checked it since Henderson. She'd been focused on the forward work, the Chicago infrastructure, and she hadn't checked the emergency channel because she hadn't expected anyone to use it. 48 hours ago, and she hadn't known. Did I receive it? She said, meaning. Did accessing the secure drop require an action on my end that could be detected? You have to open the drop to receive the message. You haven't opened it, but they know he sent it. They're monitoring him closely enough. Yes, they know the message exists. They're probably waiting to see if you surface to retrieve it. She stood up from the floor where she'd been sitting and walked to the window and looked out at the alley below. 3 in the afternoon, gray light. A man loading boxes into a truck 2 floors down, unhurried, completely unaware. Marcus, she said, I need you to listen carefully. Are you in a safe location right now? A pause. I'm at my office. Go home. Not your apartment somewhere else. Somewhere you haven't told me about, and that has no connection to me. Do it today. Don't use your regular phone after you leave. Use the secondary one I gave you. She heard him draw breath. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you what the situation requires. Zariah, what are you? They're going to find me in Chicago, she said. I don't know how long I have. And when they do, the circle of people connected to me becomes a liability, which means anyone they know I've been in contact with. I understand, he said quietly. Good. Go now. I'll contact you when I can. She hung up and stood at the window and made herself breathe slowly and deliberately and think rather than react. Acting was how you made mistakes, and she could not afford mistakes right now. They had Calvin as a censor. They had federal database access through contractors. They had identified the financial architecture, even if they hadn't penetrated it. And they were close enough to Chicago that she needed to assume they already knew she was here. She had maybe 72 hours. She went back to her equipment and she worked. She was wrong about the 72 hours. She had 41. It was the router that gave her router itself, but the signal pattern. She understood this afterward, reconstructing it with the analytical clarity she always applied to her own mistakes, which was a quality she'd had since childhood, and which had made her an extraordinary accountant and a very hard person to be. And the signal obfuscation she'd built was excellent for defeating casual surveillance. But Do-hyun's people had brought in someone who wasn't looking for her signal, they were looking for the pattern of its absence. The negative space created by a professional-grade obfuscation system in operation, which was itself a distinctive signature if you knew what you were looking for. A sound Green would do. She had been watching her own signal so carefully that she hadn't thought about what her careful watching looked like from the outside. She heard the vehicles at 11:47 at night. This time she didn't have 45 seconds. She had less, because they'd learned from Henderson, and this time they came to all the exits at once. She hit the remote wipe on the laptop, which would take 90 seconds to complete. She grabbed the secondary device, which had everything she critically needed behind 3 layers of biometric encryption that nobody was getting through without her. She dropped the secondary device into her jacket's interior pocket, and she moved. The stairwell was already compromised. She could hear boots on the lower landing, moving up, measured and fast. The roof access required a key she had, but the roof itself was exposed, and she had no exit from it that she'd prepared. She had prepared one other thing. On her second day in the loft, she had noticed that the building's freight elevator serviced a loading dock that opened onto the alley. On the building's west side, not the alley visible from her window, a different one, narrower, that ran between her building and the auto parts business. The freight elevator was operated by a physical key that the building manager kept on a hook in the unlocked maintenance room on the first floor. On her third day, she had gone to the maintenance room on the pretense of asking about the heating system. And while the building manager, an older man named Gerald, who had the particular incuriousness of someone who'd been paid not to ask questions for many years, was talking at her, she had memorized the shape of the key on the hook. On her fourth day, she had gone to a hardware store 4 miles away and had a copy made. She had the copy in her jacket pocket next to the secondary device. She hit the freight elevator call button at the end of the hallway, heard it begin to move, heard the stairwell door below her bang open, and made the calculation. The elevator was going to arrive in approximately 20 seconds, and the boots on the stairs were going to reach the third floor in approximately the same amount of time, give or take. She pressed herself against the wall beside the elevator door and waited. The boots reached the landing. The elevator arrived. She went through the elevator doors as they were still lobby button and stood in the corner of the car as its ascended and listened to shouts above her. Not panicked, professional. The controlled, rapid communication of people executing a coordinated entry and discovering their target had moved. The freight elevator opened into the loading dock. Cold air hit her like a wall. The dock's roll-up door was down but not locked, and she got under it in 3 seconds and was in the narrow west alley before the door had finished rattling back down behind her. She ran. Not south, not northwest, directly through the auto parts lot, which was closed and dark, through a gap in the chain link at the far end she had also noted on day 2, and then west again through a residential block, changing direction twice in quick succession. She was 6 blocks away and breathing hard, and her hands were shaking not from cold, but from adrenaline when she stopped in the doorway of a closed laundromat and made herself stand completely still for 30 seconds and listen. No boots, no engines close enough to be tracking her. She had gotten out. She leaned against the doorframe and looked up at the underside of the laundromat's awning and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of relief, which was all she could afford, because relief was expensive, and the situation had not improved in any meaningful sense just because she was currently not in custody. Everything was gone. The equipment, the Chicago infrastructure, 3 weeks of work. The laptop wipe had completed, she was certain of that. It was reliable, but the system was gone. The location was burned, and she was standing in a Chicago doorway at midnight with a secondary device, a dead phone, compromised network of aliases, and the particular cold clarity of someone who has just run out of prepared options. She thought about what she had left. The secondary device. Fully encrypted, biometrically locked, containing access credentials up to the financial structures she'd built. The ones Do-hyun's people had located the outer shell of but had not penetrated. The fourth identity, the one nobody knew about. Approximately $40,000 in liquid access, accessible through channels that remained clean. And her mind, which was still working, still running calculations, still doing the thing it did best, even when the rest of her was cold and shaking in a doorway. She thought about what she didn't have: a safe location, a working system, time. She thought about what she needed. She needed something that money and running couldn't provide. She needed something that fundamentally changed the nature of the situation, not just the tactical position, but the structural dynamic. She needed to stop being the person being chased and become the person holding something that made being chased unacceptably costly for the person doing the chasing. She needed leverage, not financial leverage. She had been playing that game, and it was not enough. She needed the kind of leverage that was tied specifically, personally, and irrevocably to her continued survival. The idea had been forming at the edges of her thinking for days. She had been pushing it away because it required something she had been resisting, not because she was incapable of it, but because doing it meant accepting that the situation had moved past the point where careful, measured, proportionate responses were sufficient. It meant accepting that what she was in was a war, not an escape. She had spent 11 days in Chicago building a weapon designed to hurt Do-hyun's organization. What she needed to build was not a weapon. It was a dead man's switch. She found a motel near O'Hare, paid cash, checked in as a name she invented on the spot, and which the overnight clerk did not question, because the overnight clerk at this particular motel had perfected the art of seeing nothing. The room was small and overlit and smelled like carpet cleaner applied too recently over something that hadn't fully gone away, and she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the secondary device and began taking inventory. The inventory took 2 hours. What she had been accumulating for 3 years, not with any single purpose in mind, but with the instinct of a woman who understood that information in the wrong environment was the only real currency, was extraordinary. She had built the Mujin Syndicate's financial infrastructure, which meant she had touched every part of it, which meant she understood where every dollar came from and went to, which means she had records. Not all the records, but more than enough. She had ledger data, encrypted copies of financial records covering 7 years of the syndicate's actual operations, as distinct from its reported operations. She had transaction logs linking legitimate front businesses to illegal operations in ways that would be immediately legible to any competent federal financial crimes investigator. She had account documentation for offshore structures in 4 jurisdictions. She had, and this was the piece that made her sit very still for a moment when she came to it in the inventory communications records. Not audio, not surveillance, but financial communications, the paper trail that accompanied money when it moved between people, and those trails told stories about who was paying, whom when, and in what amounts. And some of those stories involved individuals who were not members of the Mujin Syndicate and who were not criminals, or at least were not known as criminals, and who would find those financial stories extremely damaging if they were ever told publicly. She had, in short, enough to destroy Kang Do-hyun. Enough to damage his criminal enemies, enough to embarrass a number of people in positions of legitimate authority, enough to create a financial and legal catastrophe that would take years to resolve. She had been carrying this for 3 years without fully recognizing what she was carrying. She began building the system at 3 in the morning. Concept was straightforward. The execution required precision. She would aggregate and organize the most critical records structured for maximum legibility to federal investigators, journalists, and Do-hyun's criminal competitors. 3 audiences with 3 different priority and 3 different capacities to cause damage, and she would upload the entire package to a secure server system with a dead man's mechanism. A countdown timer set to 24 hours. Which would reset only if she personally logged in with a biometric credential and a secondary password known only to her. If she failed to reset it, if she disappeared, if she was imprisoned, if she was harmed, if she was simply unable to reach a device, for 24 hours the package would distribute automatically to a preloaded list of federal contacts, journalists, and anonymous tips lines with established security infrastructure. She would not need to threaten anyone directly. She would simply need to be alive and free and capable of reaching a device once every 24 hours. And everyone who understood what the package contained would understand that the only rational response to its existence was to ensure absolutely and permanently that Zariah Monroe remained alive and free. She built it with the focused, merciless precision she brought to all her best work. She did not allow herself to think about what she was doing in moral terms, because moral terms were a framework for situations that were not this situation. She thought in technical terms, in structural terms, in the language she had always been most fluent in, the language of systems and their points of failure. At 7:43 in the morning, the system was complete. She initiated the first countdown. The timer began. She sat back and looked at the ceiling and felt something move through her that was not quite relief and not quite fear, and was perhaps the specific quality of emotion that comes with passing a point you cannot come back from. She had been running for 3 weeks. She had built exits and lost them and built new ones. And those had been found, too, and she had run and changed and hidden and worked and run again, and she was tired in a way that sleeps could not address. Tired in the particular way of someone who has been surviving at full capacity for too long and whose margins are beginning to show the strain. The running was done. She understood that now. Not because she'd been caught, she hadn't. Not yet, not completely. But because running indefinitely was not a solution, it was a postponement, and postponements eventually became the thing you were postponing. She had known this on some level, since Henderson, maybe before. She had kept moving because movement felt like control and stopping felt like surrender. But stopping was not surrender if you stopped on your own terms. She was going to stop on her own terms. She looked at the timer on the screen. 23 hours and 16 minutes remaining on the first cycle. She picked up the secondary device and held it in both hands and thought about the conversation she was going to have and what it was going to require of her and how different the woman who walked into that conversation would need to be from the woman who had arrived in Seattle 3 years ago, young and sharp and skilled, and completely unprepared for the specific education she was about to receive. She had received it. She thought about what to do next, and the answer came clearly and without hesitation, which told her she had already made the decision without admitting it. The way she made all her most important decisions quietly, in the background, while her conscious mind was occupied with something else. She was going back, not running back, not surrendering, not returning to the cage, walking back on her terms with everything she'd built, aimed directly at the man who'd told her she was nothing, prepared to show him exactly what nothing was capable of. The decision sat inside her chest like something finally set down after being carried too long. She got up from the bed and went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the motel mirror, dark circles, tight jaw, eyes that had seen 3 weeks of things they hadn't seen before, and she looked at this woman and made herself a quiet, specific promise. A sound like Greenwood's side of it. She was walking out the other side of this. She went back to the secondary device and began composing the message that would bring Jamin to her, rather than waiting for him to find her. Because the other thing she had learned from Kang Do-hyun, learned by watching him operate for 3 years from the inside, learned by understanding how he thought and what he respected and what he feared. The very small list of things the man was capable of fearing was that power was never about who had the most resources, or the most people, or the most capacity for violence. Power was about who controlled the terms. She had just finished building the thing that let her control the terms. Her fingers moved over the screen, and the message took shape. And outside the motel window, Chicago was waking up into a cold gray morning that did not know or care what was happening in this room. And inside the room, a woman who had once been told she meant nothing was writing the first sentence of the last chapter of the most consequential negotiation of her life. She sent the message and put the device down and waited. Timer counted down. 23 hours and 9 minutes. She was ready. The message she sent was 6 words. I have something you need. Come. She attached a location, not the O'Hare Motel, which she had already checked out of, but a parking structure 3 miles away, level 4, northeast corner, 11A. And she sent it through the dead drop channel that Jane Spin people had been monitoring for 3 weeks, which meant she was sending it knowing they would read it before he did, which was precisely the point. She wanted them to know she was coming in. She wanted them to understand, before anyone was in the same room with her, that she was not being caught. She was choosing. That distinction was going to matter. She was at the parking structure by 10:15, having walked the perimeter twice first, noting sights and vehicle positions, and the location of the attendant booth and the stairwell exits. She was not under any illusion that she had a tactical advantage in this situation. She was one person with a device and an idea, and Jamin would arrive with multiple men and the infrastructure of an organization behind him. The advantage she had was not physical, it was informational. And informational advantages only worked if the other party understood clearly what you were holding, before anyone did anything irreversible. She stood at the northeast corner of level 4, with her back to the concrete wall and her hands visible at her sides, and she waited. They arrived at 10:58, 3 black SUVs, which was more than she'd expected, and told her something about how seriously Do-hyun was taking this. They came up the ramp in a staggered formation that covered the exits without being obvious about it, which told her the men were professional, which she had already known. Jamin got out of the second vehicle. He looked at her across the empty concrete floor of level 4, and something moved through his expression, not quite relief and not quite anger. More like the particular feeling of someone who has been searching for a thing for a long time and is not certain whether finding it is good news or not. He walked toward her alone. His men stayed with the vehicles. That told her something too. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, comprehensive, measuring, looking for information the way he looked for information in every situation. "You're not running," he said. "No, you sent the message." "Yes," he studied her face. "You look terrible. I've had a difficult 3 weeks." She held his gaze. "I need you to listen to me very carefully before anyone moves or does anything." "Can you do that?" "I'm listening. I've built a system." A dead man's switch. It contains 10 years of the Mujin Syndicate's actual financial records, transactions, offshore structures, front company connections, communications trails, a complete picture of every illegal operation Do Hyun runs. It's been organized specifically for federal investigators, for journalists, and for Do Hyun's criminal competitors. All 3 groups, simultaneously. She watched his face, which told her almost nothing, because Jae-min had spent 12 years making his face tell people nothing. "It's on a 24-hour countdown. I reset it personally every cycle with a biometric credential and a password that nobody has. If I miss a cycle for any reason, it distributes automatically." Silence. "You understand what I'm saying," she said. "I understand what you're saying." "Then you understand that the only thing that makes Dooyun safe is me being alive, unimprisoned, and free to reach a device every 24 hours. And you understand that I'm telling you this here before we get in any vehicle, because once I'm in that vehicle, I need everyone operating from the same understanding." Jamin was quiet for a moment. The parking structure was very still around them. Distant traffic sounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, nothing else. "He's going to want to verify it," Jamin said. "He can't." "That's the point. There's no version of verification that doesn't require trusting me, and there's no version of not trusting me that ends well for him." She paused. "I've had 3 weeks to think about how this conversation goes. Jamin, every version I've considered ends the same way." Another pause. "He's going to want to see you," Jamin said. "I know. Take me to him." He nodded once very slowly. "The device comes with me," she said. "I assumed." She pushed off the wall and walked toward the vehicles, and the men around them shifted slightly. That almost invisible readjustment she had learned to read 3 years ago, and she walked through it with her chin level and her breathing controlled, and her heart hitting the inside of her chest, so hard she was certain Jamin could hear it. Couldn't. She was certain he couldn't. She got in the vehicle. They flew her back to Seattle on a private aircraft that she recognized the same Gulfstream that Do-hyun used for domestic travel, cream interior, the particular smell of the recycled air system she had been on 6 times before when Do-hyun had taken her to meetings in other cities. She sat in one of the rear-facing seats with the secondary device on her knee, and Jamin across from her and 2 of his men in the seats behind her, and nobody said anything for the first 40 minutes of the flight. Outside the window, the Midwest gave way to the Rockies, which gave way to the brown and green patchwork of the Pacific Northwest. And Zariah watched it and reset the countdown timer when the cycle completed and put the device back in her jacket pocket and folded her hands in her lap. "How bad is it?" she asked. Jamin looked up from his phone. "How bad is what?" "The damage I did. From Chicago." He held her gaze for a moment. "Significant. 3 front companies are under active regulatory review. 2 payment networks are disrupted. The operating capital for the northern distribution structure has been frozen for 11 days. He paused. "Sats. There are also conversations happening between certain parties who wouldn't normally be talking to each other because they've noticed the instability and are wondering what to attribute it to. Criminal competitors. Some of them." She nodded. She had intended most of that. The part about the conversations, the circling competitors that she had also intended, though it was a riskier piece. Instability in Do-hyun's organization created openings for people who would like to expand, and that pressure from outside was part of what she was counting on to clarify Do-hyun's thinking. A man fighting on 2 fronts, external pressure from competitors and internal hemorrhaging from her financial work, was a man who needed the bleeding to stop. She was the only person who could stop it. He's been awake, Jamin said, unprompted. It was the closest he had ever come to telling her something she hadn't asked for. She looked at him. Since Chicago. Since we knew you were there and lost you again. He looked back at his phone. I'm telling you so you're not surprised by what you walk into. She thought about that. About Do-hyun not sleeping. About the controlled, impenetrable man she had spent 3 years watching operate with absolute composure in situations that would have broken most people. Not sleeping because a woman he had dismissed as a calculator had walked out of his building and spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling his world. She didn't know what to do with that information. She filed it. Thank you, she said. Jamin said nothing. He looked out his window. The plane descended toward Seattle through a sky that was doing what Seattle skies did in November pouring. The state was outside the city proper on a stretch of waterfront south of Tacoma that Do-hyun had acquired 7 years ago and developed into something that occupied the space between home and fortress without being clearly either. She had been there twice before, both times for meetings that required the kind of security that the penthouse couldn't provide. It had been built around a central structure that was large, without being ostentatious, surrounded by grounds that were landscaped precisely enough to be elegant and strategically enough to eliminate approach angles. And the waterfront side faced a stretch of Puget Sound that was currently invisible behind rain and low cloud. She could hear the water when they got out of the cars. Just hear it, the sound of wind-driven rain against the surface of the Sound, the particular white noise of a Pacific storm doing what Pacific storms did without caring about anything happening on the shore. Jamin walked her inside. The interior was different from what she remembered. The last time she'd been here, it had been controlled and precise. Every surface, an object in its correct position, the kind of environment that reflected its owner's need for things to be ordered. Now there was a quality to the space that was harder to name. Papers on the table, in the main corridor, empty cups, a jacket thrown over a chair rather than hung. Small things. But in a space that was never small about anything, they were legible. Jamin stopped outside the closed door to the private study. He's in there, he said. She looked at the door. Jamin. She said it without looking at him. Yes, if this goes wrong, if something happens that I didn't plan for, make sure the message gets out. A very long pause. I work for Do-hyun, he said. I know. She finally looked at him. I'm asking anyway. He looked back at her with that face that gave nothing away, and then he did the thing she had not expected. He nodded. Once, barely perceptible, and then he stepped back. She opened the door. He was standing at the window. Of course he was standing at the window. He had been standing at a window the first time she ever saw him, 7 years ago, and 42 floors above a different body of water, and some part of her noted the symmetry with the detached, exhausted recognition of a person who has run out of the energy required to be surprised by anything. But Jamin had told her, and she had filed it, and still she was not fully prepared for what she saw when he turned. Do-hyun was 40 years old, and he had always looked exactly 40, not in an aged sense, in the sense of a man who had arrived at a particular configuration of himself and settled there with authority. The man who turned from the window now was still that man, would always be that man. But there were new things written on him. His jaw was unshaven by several days, not the cultivated kind, the actual kind. There were shadows under his eyes that she had never seen on him before. His shirt was not quite right, a collar open when he would normally not have it open, and the study around him had the quality of a space where someone had been spending too much time in the grip of something they couldn't put down. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a very long time and was probably 8 seconds. Sit down, he said finally. I'll stand. A pause. He absorbed this. You look, he started. I know how I look, she said. We don't need to do that part. His jaw tightened slightly. He moved away from the window and toward the desk, and she tracked the movement the way she had always tracked his movements automatically, without deciding to. A 3-year habit she apparently had not broken, despite everything. He didn't sit at the desk. He stood beside it with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she was having difficulty reading, which was unusual. She could normally read him. 3 weeks had changed something. She wasn't sure in which direction. You built a dead man's switch, he said. Yes. Jamin briefed me on the vehicle. Good. Then we don't have to spend time on the technical explanation. I want to hear it from you. She held his gaze. 10 years of records. Complete financial picture of the syndicate's actual operations. Pre-packaged for federal investigators, journalists, and your competitors. 24-hour countdown, personal biometric reset. If I miss a cycle for any reason, it releases. Automatically. Yes, he was quiet. He had a very particular quality of quiet, dense, inhabited, the kind of silenceness that was doing a great deal of work. She had spent 3 years learning to wait through it without filling it, which was one of the more useful things captivity had taught her. Show me, he said. No. A beat. Zariah, there's nothing to show you. That's the architecture. If I show you the system, I've given you information about the system. The system's value to me depends on you not having that information. She kept her voice level. You're not going to verify it. You're going to decide whether you believe I built it. And you know me well enough to answer that question without my help. He looked at her for a long time. You built it, he said. Yes. In a motel room in Chicago. Yes. Something moved across his face that she still could not name. He pulled the chair from behind the desk, not his chair. The chair on the other side, the one visitors sat in, and he sat down in it and looked up at her. A sound like green wood splitting, which put her above him in the room for the first time in 3 years in any conversation they'd had. And she was not sure he'd done it intentionally, and she was not sure he hadn't. You've also done significant damage to my operations, he said. Yes, the regulatory action is the most immediate problem. The front companies can be stabilized. The anomalies I introduced are reversible if you get competent counsel engaged within the next 2 weeks. The offshore payment disruption will resolve itself in 30 days if nobody touches it. The operating capital freeze can be lifted. I know exactly how it was structured, and it can be unwound. She paused. I know how to fix everything I broke. That's also part of the architecture. He looked at her steadily. You're offering to repair the damage. I'm telling you the damage is repairable if we reach an agreement. I'm not offering anything until we've talked about terms. He was quiet again. Then Seola, she waited. The alliance is over. The marriage, he stopped, which was the first time she had ever heard him stop mid-sentence in conversation. The Yoon family withdrew when the instability started. Bai Young-soo doesn't want his daughter associated with an organization under regulatory scrutiny. A pause. She's gone. Zariah absorbed this. It meant several things simultaneously, and she processed them all and did not allow any of the processing to show on her face. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it, technically. Not for Seola's absence, she was not going to pretend that, but for the structural loss it represented, the alliance and the shipping corridors, and the political capital. That was real damage, real consequence, and she was not in the business of being dishonest about consequences. Are you, he said. It's a significant operational loss. I'm sorry for that part. Something that was almost a sound came from him, not quite a laugh, not quite anything, just the brief audible acknowledgement of the particular kind of absurdity they were both operating inside. Sit down, he said again. She sat. Not because he'd told her to. She had decided to, because she was exhausted, and her legs were telling her in very plain language that they had been through a great deal in the past 3 weeks, and they were reaching the end of their patience. She sat in the chair across from him, and they were the same height now, and he looked at her across the short distance between them. What do you want, he said. Freedom, she said. Complete. Permanent. I want enough to rebuild my life in a way that is not traceable back to this world. I want transportation out of the country. And I want your word, not just yours, binding on the organization that nobody associated with the Mujin Syndicate ever looks for me again. Any reason, any circumstance. He held her gaze. His face was very still. And the switch, he said, remains active. Always. I reset it every 24 hours for the rest of my life. It's not a threat, it's a structure. The structure guarantees your safety and mine simultaneously. Neither of us can harm the other without self-destructing. That's not a threat, Do-hyun. That's the most stable arrangement 2 people in our position can have. A long silence. You planned this, he said. The message, the location, coming back. You planned this from the motel. Yes. You planned it before you ran. She considered the honesty of this. I planned the exit. I didn't plan to come back this way. A pause. Some of it was improvised. Which parts? Chicago. Most of Chicago was improvised. She held his gaze. The dead man's switch was not improvised. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the most direct attention she had ever received from him, more direct than any meeting, any argument, any late night over financial projections. Exhaustion. The face was very close up now, and she could see the actual texture of what 3 weeks had done to him, and she made herself look at it without interpreting it, without reading into it the things she had once wanted to read into it. Because she was done with wanting things from Kang Do-yoon, and she needed to stay done. I underestimated you, he said. She didn't respond. I've never said that to anyone in my life. He said it with a particular kind of precision, like he was handling the sentence carefully. You should know that. You told me I meant nothing, she said. Her voice came out flat, not angry flat, which was worse, and she knew it. In a room full of people, with exactly the specific clarity of someone who wanted it to land hard. He didn't look away, yes. Was it true? The question sat between them. His jaw worked slightly. No. Then why? He was quiet for a moment that had more weight than most silences she'd sat through. Because you were asking me something I didn't know how to answer without losing control of a situation that required me to not lose control. Because the Eunice Alliance was 8 months in the making, and the conversation was happening at the worst possible moment, and he stopped again. I chose the organization. You always choose the organization. Yes, that's an answer, she said. It's not an apology, but it's an honest answer, and I'll take honest over performative. He looked at her steadily. Then he stood, which put him above her again, and he moved to the heavy storage cabinet against the far wall old wood, built into the room, and he opened it and reached to the back and removed something she didn't immediately recognize. Compact case, brushed metal, the kind that could belong to a dozen different categories of valuable thing. He set it on the desk in front of her and opened it. Cash, dense, banded, organized with the precision she associated with everything he did. She didn't count it, but she could estimate from the configuration substantial. More than substantial. Beside the case, from the same cabinet, he set a sat phone, a document envelope, a set of keys she didn't recognize. The keys are for a vehicle in the garage, he said. Clean registration. Nothing traceable to the organization. He gestured to the envelope. Documentation for 3 countries. One of them has a financial system architecture you'll find useful. She looked at the objects on the desk. She looked at him. The phone, she said, fully clean, purchased through a chain I use for complete severance situations. Nobody has the number except you. She exhaled slowly. There's one condition, he said. She went still. Not a condition, he corrected himself, which she had never heard him do. A request. He held her gaze. Fix the front companies before you leave. Give me the specific corrections. Not because I'm trying to keep you here. You have my word on the terms you outlined, and I don't give my word unless I mean it, which you know. He paused. Because you broke them, and I'm asking you to repair what you broke. That's all. She looked at him for a moment. How long would that take? She said. You tell me. 48 hours. If I have full access to the relevant accounts and systems. You'll have it. She looked at the objects on the desk again. The case. The phone. The envelope. Something was happening in her chest that she was not going to examine closely. Not in this room. Not in front of this man. She was going to stay focused on the transaction, because the transaction was what was real. The transaction was what she could control. The transaction was what she had built and fought for, and driven across half the country to achieve. She reached out and picked up the sat phone, turned it over in her hands. Set it back down. The switch stays active, she said. I know. Forever, non-negotiable, understood. If I ever receive indication that someone from this organization is looking for me, they won't be, he said, quietly, with the particular quality of certainty he reserved for things he had already decided. "I give you my word." She nodded once. She reached for the case. Her hand stopped 2 inches short of it when the study door opened without a knock. Both of them turned. Park Sung-jin stood in the doorway. Sung-jin was Do-hyun's head of external operations, a position that put him third in the organizational hierarchy, behind only Do-hyun and Jaemin, a position he had held for 4 years, and which he had, in Zariah's 3 years of close financial observation, used to build a secondary web of relationships and financial interests that did not entirely align with the Mujin Syndicate's organizational interests. She had noticed this the way she noticed most things, quietly, filing it, not acting on it because it wasn't her organization to protect. She noticed now the look on his face when he saw her. It was not surprise. It was something else, something that moved through his expression and was gone too fast to fully read, and it landed in her stomach like a stone before her mind had caught up to why. "I heard the car," Sung-jin said. His voice was easy measured. He was looking at Do-hyun. "I didn't realize she'd been brought in already." "We just arrived," Jaemin said from behind him. He had come in with Sung-jin, or immediately after, Zariah couldn't tell which. She looked at Jaemin's face. Jaemin was looking at Sung-jin. Not at her. Not at Do-hyun. At Sung-jin, with the particular focused attention of a man who was computing something rapidly and had not yet finished computing it. Something had shifted in the room. A temperature change that had nothing to do with the Pacific storm still driving rain against the windows. Do-hyun felt it too. She could see it in the micro-adjustment of his posture, nearly imperceptible. The kind of thing she had learned to read because she had needed to read it. The slight redistribution of weight. The orientation of his attention. "Sung-jin," Do-hyun said. His voice was completely neutral. "Give us a few minutes, of course." Sung-jin didn't move immediately. His eyes went to the case on the desk, to the phone, to the envelope, and Zariah watched the inventory happening behind his eyes, and the inventory took about 2 seconds, and at the end of it, his face had reorganized itself back into ease. "I just wanted to confirm she was here safely," she as Do-hyun said. Sung-jin nodded and pulled the door closed. In the silence that followed, Zariah became aware of several things simultaneously: her own heartbeat, which had accelerated, the sound of the rain against the windows, Jaemin standing just inside the closed door with a stillness that was different from his usual, and the expression on Do-hyun's face which was the most difficult to read she had ever seen. "Do-hyun," she said. He was looking at the closed door. "Do-hyun." She said it again, with the specific weight of someone asking a question they already know will have a bad answer. He looked at her. "How long?" she said. "Has Sung-jin been the reason your people kept finding me?" The room was very quiet. Jaemin spoke first. "Not finding you," he said, and his voice had a quality she had never heard from him before, compressed, careful, the voice of a man holding something in very tight. "Sung-jin wasn't feeding us information about where you were. Feeding information to someone else about where you were so they could reach you before we did." She stared at him. "Who, the Daesung network," Do-hyun said. He said it like the words cost him something. Min-jun, his jaw was tight. Very tight. "Sung-jin has been in a secondary arrangement with Daesung, for we're still determining how long." "Long enough." He paused. "The intelligence contractor who identified your signal in Chicago. He was contracted through Sung-jin, not through my organization directly. Through Sung-jin's parallel channel, the full shape of it landed. The Nevada Motel, Chicago, the alias exposure. He wasn't helping you find me," she said slowly. "He was helping Daesung track me, so Daesung could get to me first. As leverage against you. Yes. Which means Daesung knew where I was before your people did, multiple times, and chose not to move, because taking you openly would have started a war they might not win. Sung-jin was building a longer play." Do-hyun's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not quite rage, something darker and colder than rage, the specific emotion of a man confronting a betrayal from inside his own house. He was positioning, waiting for the right moment to reveal that Daesung held something I wanted and that I'd been looking for, and use it to renegotiate the balance of power on the coast. She sat very still. He walked in here to confirm I was here, she said. Yes. And that we were reaching an agreement. Yes. So now Desung knows I'm here and that I have something you value enough to offer terms for. The silence in the room had a different quality than anything that had come before it. Do-hyun turned to Jae-min, and something passed between them in the specific shorthand of 12 years of working together, not words. A sound like green wood splitting, just the compressed communication of two people who have been in enough dangerous rooms to have developed their own language for them. Jae-min was on his phone before Do-hyun finished, turning back to her. How long, she said, before Daesung moves on this information. Song Min-jun is cautious, Do-hyun said. He'll want to verify it first. Confirm the terms, understand the nature of what you have. He won't move without understanding what he's dealing with. He looked at her. You have time, how much? Not days. She picked up the sat phone from the desk. She checked the countdown on her secondary device. 17 hours, 42 minutes remaining on the current cycle. Do you know where Sung Jin is right now? She said. Jae-min, Do-hyun said. Working on it, Jae-min said from the corner, phone pressed to his ear. She stood up. Her legs had recovered enough to be reliable. She was grateful for that. She looked at Do-hyun, and he looked back at her, and they were standing in a study in a waterfront-specific storm with what remained of everything they'd built and destroyed between them, and there was no clean version of any of this. There had never been a clean version, and she had known that, and she had come back anyway, because clean was not on the table, and she was done waiting for things that were not on the table. Whatever you're planning to do about Sung Jin, she said, do it quickly. Because if Daesung understands what the dead man's switch contains, they're going to want me not as leverage against you. She held his gaze. They're going to want me gone. The rain hit the windows. Do-hyun turned toward the door. Stay in this room, he said. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He went through the door with Jae-min behind him, and the sound of their footsteps moved away down the corridor. And Zariah stood in the study, with the sat phone in her hand, and the secondary device counting down in her pocket, and the cash and the documents on the desk in front of her. And she listened to the storm outside and to the sounds of the estate around her. And she thought about Song Min-jun, and what a careful patient man who had just received critical intelligence about an asset with a dead man's switch would do in the next 4 hours, and every answer she came up with pointed in the same direction. She checked the doors and windows with the systematic attention of someone who had spent 3 weeks living inside dangerous situations and had developed a very clear understanding of what it felt like when the danger was about to change shape. It felt like this, exactly like this. She stood in the center of the study and breathed steadily, and waited, and outside the storm drove rain against the sound, and the sound didn't care, and somewhere in this building, or outside it, or on his way to it, the situation was preparing to become something none of them had fully planned for. And Zariah Monroe, who had spent 3 years learning that survival required you to be smarter than the room you were standing in, began doing the only thing she knew how to do when the ground shifted under everything. She started calculating. She heard the shot from inside the study. One shot, muffled by distance and walls and the ongoing violence of the storm outside, but unmistakably a shot, the specific sound of it, cutting through the rain noise in a way that rain noise could not quite cover. She was on her feet before the echo finished, moving to the wall beside the door rather than toward it, back flat against the brick, secondary device in her left hand and the sat phone in her right, because she had no weapon and the wall was the next best thing. Silence for 4 seconds. Then boots in the corridor, fast but not panicked, and she recognized the rhythm of them a half second. Before the door opened Jae-min's walk, she had memorized it without intending to over 3 years of hearing it approach her various rooms at various hours, and she stepped out from the wall as he came through. He was intact. No blood. His face was doing the compression thing it did under pressure, features pulled to the minimum necessary expression. Sung Jin, she said. Contained. He said it with the specific flatness of a man who had decided the word was sufficient and would not be elaborating. Is he? Jae-min said again, and she understood from the way he said it the second first that the question had been answered as completely as it was going to be answered. She absorbed this, Dae-sung. Song Min-jun was briefed by Sung-jin an hour ago. We intercepted the communication. He moved to the desk, picked up the document envelope she hadn't yet touched, and held it out to her. Do-hyun needs 20 minutes. There's a situation on the south side of the property. Dae-sung is here, she said. Not a question, 2 vehicles. They were already moving before we found Sung-jin. He must have called them before he came into the study. Jaemin's jaw was tight. They're not here for Do-hyun. They're here because of what you told Sung-jin you have. I didn't tell Sung-jin anything. He heard enough from the doorway. He held the envelope out again. Go to the east corridor. There's a room at the end, reinforced door, external lock. Stay inside it until I come for you. She took the envelope. How many men does Do-hyun have on the property? She said. Enough. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting. He was already moving back toward the door. East corridor. End of the hall. Door with the gray panel. Jaemin. She said it with enough weight that he stopped. If something happens to Do-hyun tonight, if the situation on the south side goes wrong, the switch doesn't protect me from Dae-sung. It only protects me from the Mujin Syndicate. You understand that? He looked at her across the study. Then let's make sure nothing happens to Do-hyun, he said, and went through the door. She stood in the study for precisely 2 seconds, which was how long she allowed herself, and then she went to and opened the metal case and took half the cash out and put it in the interior pocket of her jacket beside the secondary device. Because all of it was too much to carry quickly, and half of it was enough to matter, and she had learned over the past 3 weeks that the difference between survival and not surviving was sometimes the difference between being able to move fast and being slowed by the weight of what you were carrying. She left the rest on the desk. She picked up the document envelope and the sat phone, and she went east. The room at the end of the east corridor was what Jaemin had called it, reinforced, door, gray panel on the lock, the kind of room that existed in a building like this for exactly the kind of evening this had become. She went inside and locked it from the interior, and stood in the dark for a moment before she found the light switch, a single overhead fixture that illuminated a space about the size of her motel room in Henderson, concrete walls, a folding chair, a shelf with emergency supplies. She did an inventory because she was focused on the secondary device and the countdown. 14 hours, 11 minutes. She sat on the folding chair and listened. The storm was louder here. This side of the building faced toward the water, and the windows, if there were windows behind the section of wall she was looking at, were taking the full weight of the wind. She could hear it in the structure of the building itself, the particular low vibration of something large being pushed. Underneath that, occasionally, sounds that she worked to identify, and mostly could not because they were too muffled and too far movement, possibly voices. Once, what might have been another shot, and might have been the storm doing something to a loose fixture. She opened the document envelope. 3 passports. 3 different countries. As Do-hyun had said, one she had expected, one that surprised her, one that she turned over in her hands and looked at for a moment before setting down. All 3 were complete. The documentation quality was excellent, better than Calvin's work, she thought, which was a professional assessment she made without particular emotion attached to it. Inside the envelope behind the passports were account access documents for 2 financial institutions she recognized as genuinely clean, genuinely offshore, and genuinely difficult for any domestic authority to subpoena. The amounts preloaded were. She sat very still when she saw the amounts. She had told Do-hyun enough to rebuild my life. The number in the account documents was not enough. It was the kind of number that meant he had either decided to be generous in a way that surprised her, or had made a calculation about what genuine permanence cost and had funded it accordingly. She thought about which of those was more likely, given what she knew about Do-hyun. She put the documents back in the envelope. Outside the reinforced door, the sounds of the estate continued to move and shift, and she sat in the folding chair and watched the door and counted her own breaths and waited. It was 47 minutes before the knock came. Not Jaemin's knock, she knew Jaemin's knock had memorized it in the penthouse the way she'd memorized every other recurring sound in her captivity, the specific cadence of it. This was two knocks, a pause, one knock, which was a pattern she didn't recognize, and she stood up from the chair and moved to the wall beside the door rather than toward it. "It's Do-hyun," said a voice on the other side. She recognized his voice without question. She had spent 3 years in close enough proximity to know it through a wall, in the dark, half asleep. She also knew that recognizing someone's voice was not the same as understanding the situation they were in when they spoke, so she stayed at the wall. "Are you alone?" she said, a pause. "Yes." "Is the situation resolved?" A longer pause. "Mostly." She unlocked the door. He came through it, and she was already 2 steps back, enough distance to read him before she responded to anything. She looked. She looked carefully, not physically hurt. Or if he was nothing that was visible, his jacket was gone. His shirt had something on the cuff that might have been water and might have been something else, and she chose not to examine it closely. Blicking. He was breathing with the specific controlled depth of a man who had been doing something physically demanding in the past hour and was managing the aftermath of it. He looked at her. He took in the position she'd taken, 2 steps back, wall to her left, secondary device in her hand. "Song Min-jun's people are gone," he said. 2 vehicles. "They're gone. Gone how?" He held her gaze. "Gone." She nodded once. Sung-jin. Sung-jin had been running the parallel operation for 14 months. He said it evenly, the way he said things that cost him quietly, with the precision of someone who had already processed the emotion privately and was now operating in the aftermath. The Daesung arrangement was his exit strategy. He was building toward a split, taking a portion of the northern territory with Daesung support, using you as the opening move. A pause. "He'd been telling Song Min-jun about you for 8 months. Before you left." She heard this land. "He knew I was planning something," she said. He suspected. He didn't have specifics. If he had had specifics, he would have moved earlier. But he knew you were too valuable to lose and too dangerous to keep indefinitely, and he was watching for the moment Do-hyun's handling of you created a usable fracture. His jaw tightened. "The gala. When you confronted me at the gala, he saw that. He saw enough. He started accelerating his timeline the following week." She absorbed this slowly. 14 months of surveillance by someone inside the organization. The Nevada motel, not just Do-hyun's people tracking her aliases, but Sung-jin feeding Daesung's contractors her position. Chicago. The signal detection. "He wasn't trying to help Daesung capture me," she said, working through it. "He was positioning me as an asset to hand over at the right moment, to demonstrate his value to Song Min-jun's organization. As a demonstration of capability. Yes, he was going to sell me to Daesung." Do-hyun said nothing, which was its own answer. She sat down on the folding chair. Not because her legs had given out, they hadn't. She was all right. She was managing, but because she needed a moment, and the chair was there, and she took it without apology, which was something she had not done enough of in the past 3 years. "You didn't know," she said. "No. You had a traitor in your 3rd position for over a year, and you didn't know." "No." He said it without defensiveness, which she respected. Defensiveness would have meant he was protecting his ego rather than engaging with the reality. "I didn't know." She looked at the floor for a moment. "Concrete, cold, real. The people who found me," she said. "The contractors in Nevada and Chicago. They were working for Sung-jin's channel, not yours. The alias information came from my interrogation of Calvin Marsh," Do-hyun said. "That part was mine. But the signal detection in Chicago, the technical contractor who identified your obfuscation pattern, that was Sung-jin's resource. He ran it parallel to my search and fed the information to Daesung before he gave it to Jae-min." A pause. "We found the communication records tonight. Sung-jin told Song Min-jun your Chicago location 12 hours before he told me." 12 hours. She thought about those 12 hours. About the vehicles in the lot. About the window she'd gone through, and the fence and the Honda and the long drive east into the gray morning. Daesung had been there first. They hadn't moved. Because they were still waiting for Sung-jin's signal, still building the play, still not ready to tip their hand. She had escaped from 2 organizations simultaneously without knowing it. Something moved through her that was not quite dark humor and not quite anything else, the specific feeling of discovering that the situation had been even more dangerous than she'd known, and that she had survived it anyway. Which was less greenwood splitting, which was less reassuring than it might have been, because it meant she had also been operating with incomplete information, which was the thing she was least able to tolerate about herself. You should have better internal security, she said. I'm aware of that, he said. 14 months is a long time for something to go undetected. I know. If I'd still been running your finances, I would have caught it. The secondary financial flows between Sung Jin and Dae Sung's payment channels. She stopped herself. This was not the conversation she needed to be having. This was her brain defaulting to the mode it had operated in for 3 years, the mode where she solved his problems, because his problems were the container her professional life existed inside. She was done with that. That's not my problem anymore, she said. No, he agreed, it's not. She looked up at him. He was leaning against the wall near the door, arms at his sides, watching her with the focused attention she had spent three years being the object of, and had never entirely known what to do with. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere after a very long trip and was not entirely sure what the place was called. The terms I outlined, she said, they still stand. It's all of them. Yes, he said it without hesitation. She stood up, picked up the envelope and the sat phone. I need to leave tonight, she said. I'm not staying until morning. I'm not. She stopped, reorganized. The longer I'm in Seattle, the more complicated it becomes. Whatever Sung Jin's people know, whoever else he communicated with, this location may not be clean by morning. I have a car ready. Jamin will take you to a private airfield, not SeaTac. Pilot is someone I trust. He paused. One of perhaps 3 people I trust after tonight. She heard what was underneath that and chose not to respond to it directly. The front company, she said. The stabilization work. You said 48 hours. I said 48 hours if I was on site with full access. She looked at him. I'll do it remotely. Send the access credentials to the sat phone. I'll work from wherever I land and send you the correction protocols within 72 hours. Everything you need to unwind the regulatory flags and restore the payment networks. A pause. I'll honor that. You have my word. He looked at her for a moment. That's more than the agreement required, he said. Broke it. I'll fix it. That's not generosity. It's I don't leave things broken that I know how to fix. She said it plainly, without ornamentation. It's how I'm built. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. He was constitutionally incapable of doing anything dramatically. It was one of the things she had learned to read about him over time, that his significant moments were always quiet. But something shifted. Zariah, he said. He looked at him. A sound like green wood splitting. She kept her face neutral and her breathing steady, and she made herself look at him directly, because looking away would have meant something she didn't want it to mean. I want to say something that isn't about terms, he said. You can tell me not to. A pause. Say it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, which with him was not stalling, it was the opposite. It was the precision of a man who chose his words with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, which had always been both the most compelling and most infuriating thing about him. What I said at the gala, he said, I need you to know it wasn't strategy. I know it looked like strategy. I know the most logical reading of it is that I was managing a situation and you were a variable in it. He paused. That's not what it was, she waited. I was afraid, he said. The word sat in the room with the particular weight of something that had never been said before by the person saying it. Not of you, of what it meant, that you were asking me that question in that room at that moment. What it would have required of me to answer it honestly. He held her gaze. I've built everything I have by maintaining absolute control of what I allow to matter to me. It's not a choice I make consciously anymore. It's structural. It's how I function. A pause. You were asking me to be a different kind of person than I'd spent 20 years becoming. She looked at him for a long time, and instead of that, she said carefully, you chose to make me feel like nothing. Yes, because that was easier, because that was what I knew how to do. She breathed in slowly, let it out. I understand the mechanism, she said. I understand it doesn't mean you're a good man. I understand that being able to explain why you did a thing doesn't make the thing less damaging. She held his gaze. I also understand that you're telling me this now, and that you're telling me it as close to honestly as you're capable of, and I'm not going to dismiss that. A pause. But it doesn't change what I'm doing. I know, he said. I'm still leaving. I know. And I'm not going to, she stopped. Reorganized again. I'm not going to carry what happened here into whatever comes next. I'm not going to spend the next decade angry at a man I chose to stay close to for 3 years, partly because I wanted to, and partly because I didn't have a choice, and the line between those two things was never as clean as I needed it to be. She said it plainly, which was the only way she knew how to say hard things. I'm going to put it down, all of it, and walk out of it. He was very still. That's more grace than I gave you, he said. Yes, she said simply, it is. Jae-min was waiting in the main corridor with a jacket she didn't recognize heavier than the one she'd been wearing, waterproof, practical for the kind of November night they were about to walk into. He held it out to her without comment, and she put it on, and he nodded once, which was Jaemin's version of several things simultaneously. They walked to the garage, the three of them, through the interior of the estate. She passed the study door without looking at it, past the main room where the table still had the residue of 3 weeks of something that had not been living so much as existing under pressure, past the foyer where she had arrived, that evening in Jaemin's SUV, with the sat phone on her knee and the dead man's switch, counting down. In the garage, the car was what Do-yoon had said, clean, nondescript, the kind of vehicle that existed in large numbers on Pacific Northwest roads, and disappeared into traffic without prompting a second glance. Jae-min took the driver's seat. She got in the back. Do-yoon stood at the garage door. She looked at him through the car window. He looked back at her. She did not have anything left to say, and she did not think he did either. And so she looked at him for 3 seconds in the way she had sometimes looked at him in the penthouse when she thought he wasn't paying attention directly, and without the professional gloss she had learned to maintain, and then she looked forward. Jae-min pulled out of the garage. She did not look in the rearview mirror. The airfield was 40 minutes south in the dark and rain, a small private facility that handled the kind of traffic that preferred not to appear in commercial aviation records. Jae-min drove without speaking, and she sat in the back and watched the wet November highway go past and held the secondary device in her lap and reset the countdown when the cycle turned over. 12 hours, 43 minutes. She would be out of the country before the next cycle. She would reset it from wherever she landed, and she would reset it every 24 hours after that, for as long as the agreement needed to hold, which she understood from a structural standpoint was probably for the rest of her life or the rest of Do-yoon's, whichever ended first. She had made peace with this at the O'Hare Motel, sitting on the edge of the bed, building the system. The dead man switch was not a burden. It was the price of the specific freedom she was purchasing, and the price was one she could pay with both hands and still have something left. At the airfield, Jae-min parked and got out and held the door for her, which he had done every time she'd gotten in and out of a car for 3 years, and which tonight felt like something different than it had all those other times without her being able to articulate precisely what the difference was. The plane was waiting. Small 8-seat, the engines already running. Pilot she had never seen before stood at the steps, a woman, middle-aged, with the particular focused quietness of a professional in the middle of a job. Zariah stood on the tarmac in the rain and looked at the plane and felt the cold of it, the actual physical cold of a November night on the Pacific coast. In a way she hadn't felt cold in 3 weeks of running because she'd been too focused on the next problem to feel anything as simple as weather. She was cold now. She was very tired. She was going to be all right. She turned to Jae-min. He was standing 2 feet behind her, hands at his sides, that comprehensive face doing the thing it did where it conveyed nothing, and somehow still managed to convey something. You stepped aside, she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. Tonight at the door in the study. You nodded. I heard what you asked, he said, in case something went wrong. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Jae-min's moments of quiet were different from Do-hyun's less dense. the silence of a man who had an answer and was deciding whether to give it, rather than a man who was constructing the answer in real time. Because you survived 3 years in his world, he said, finally, and you survived 3 weeks outside it. And you came back on your own terms with a mechanism he couldn't dismantle, and you sat in that study and held your ground without ever once losing your composure. A pause. That deserved to get out. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. For the 3 years, too. For the parts where you were as decent as the situation allowed. Something moved through his expression. Not much. Enough. Get on the plane, Miss Monroe, he said. She turned and walked up the steps. She slept for the first 4 hours of the flight, which surprised her. She had not expected to be able to sleep, had expected to spend the flight in the same wired, calculating state she'd been operating in for 3 weeks. But the moment the plane leveled off and the engine noise settled into its cruising frequency, something in her simply stopped. The way a machine stops when you finally remove a load it has been running under too long. And she was unconscious before she had finished deciding whether to close her eyes. She dreamed nothing. She was grateful for that. She woke over the Pacific with gray light coming through the small oval window and the secondary device in her jacket pocket and the document envelope wedged between her hip and the armrest. She sat up slowly and looked out the window at the ocean below, which from this altitude looked completely still, which she knew was an illusion. Nothing that large was ever still, but which from up here looked like something finally settled. She checked the countdown, reset it, put the device away. She opened the document envelope and looked at the 3 passports again. In the daylight coming through the window, she could see the work more clearly, the quality of the printing, the consistency of the materials, particular details that distinguished functional documentation from the kind that fell apart under scrutiny. Do-Hyun's people had done this well. She made note of which identity she would use on arrival, which she would transition to within the first 30 days, what the sequence would be. She was already planning. She recognized this about herself without judgment. It was simply what her mind did. The planning, the forward motion, the next problem assessed and mapped before the current one was fully resolved. She had fought it sometimes in the penthouse. That relentless forward calculation had sometimes wished she could simply be in a room without her brain treating the room as a system to be understood and managed. She did not fight it now. It was hers. It was the thing that had gotten her out and through and onto this plane, and she was done being ambivalent about the parts of herself that had kept her alive. She thought about the front companies, about the correction protocols she'd promised, about the specific financial architecture of each remediation, which she had already begun mapping in the reinforced room while she was waiting, because she could not help it, because this was what she did when she was afraid she worked. She planned, she solved the next problem so that the solving could occupy the part of her brain that would otherwise spend its energy on the things she was afraid of. She would send the corrections as she had promised. Not because she owed it, she did not strictly owe it. The terms she had demanded were satisfied by the documents and the money and the transportation. The front company work was above and beyond. But she had said she would, and she kept her word, in the way she had always kept her word, which was quietly and without fanfare and regardless of whether anyone was watching. She pulled out the sat phone and began drafting the first of the correction protocols from memory. Writing it in the shorthand she and Do-Hyun's financial systems had always used. A sound like green wood splitting the private language of numbers and account structures that she had spent 3 years building and that she was now using for the last time in his service. She worked for 2 hours, waits. When she finished, she looked at what she'd written 12 pages of precise, actionable correction instructions covering every piece of damage she'd introduced, and she felt something she did not expect to feel, a kind of professional pride. Clean and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of someone who does difficult work and does it completely. She sent it to the sat phone number she'd been given. She put the phone away. She looked out the window at the ocean and let herself think, for one contained and deliberate moment, about Do-Hyun. Not about what they had been or hadn't been, or what the gala had cost her, or what the study last night had meant. She thought about him as a person complicated, controlled, capable of a cruelty that was structural rather than sadistic, and therefore in some ways harder to hold on to than the simple kind standing in a garage doorway, watching a car pull away in the rain. She thought about the nod, the emergency fund, the 3 passports, and the accounts and the number that was more than enough. She did not try to make it into something simple. It was not simple. He was not simple, and she was not simple, and 3 years of proximity under the conditions they had existed under was not a thing that resolved into a clean feeling, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and it. She let it be complicated. She let it be what it was, which was real, the complicated, irreducible, morally imperfect realness of 2 people who had existed in each other's gravity for 3 years and had each, in their own way, failed and survived and changed. And then she put it down, not violently, not with effort. She simply sit beside the oval window and left it there, the way you leave a coat in a room you're not returning to, and she turned back to the document envelope and began planning the first week of what came next. She landed in the morning of a city that was not Seattle and was not Chicago, and was not anywhere she had ever been, which was precisely the point. Splitting. The air coming through the jetway was different, warmer, carrying something she couldn't immediately identify, a combination of sea salt and something green and the particular smell of a place that did not know her name. She cleared customs under the first passport. The officer looked at her face and looked at the document, and looked at her face again and handed it back without question, which was how good documentation worked not by being invisible, but by being exactly ordinary enough to be believed. She took a taxi to a hotel she had researched on the plane, a mid-range place in a commercial district that catered to business travelers, and therefore to people who did not expect to be known or to know anyone. She checked in. She was given a key card. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and went to a room that was clean and adequately lit and entirely anonymous, and she set the envelope and the sat phone and the secondary device on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did, moving, producing sound, being indifferent to the person in the 4th floor room who had just arrived from the other side of everything. She reset the countdown, checked the account access documents, made 2 notes about the sequence of financial steps she would take in the first week to establish local infrastructure without triggering reporting requirements. Then she put everything on the desk and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She was alive. She was free. She was in possession of enough to build with, and a mind that knew how to build, a set of skills that had survived 3 years of being used in service of someone else's empire and come out the other side still intact, still sharp, still hers. She thought about what she was going to do with them. The answer had been forming at the edges since before Henderson, maybe, since she'd sat on the edge of the penthouse bed in the green dress and begun counting what she had. She had spent 3 years keeping criminal money safe from scrutiny. She knew exactly how it was hidden, how it moved, what the structures looked like from inside the machine. She knew every technique, every shell construction, every layering method, every compliance gap that enabled the movement of money that was destroying people who never knew a Mujin syndicate or a Kang Do-hyun existed. She knew this world from the inside, which meant she knew how to dismantle it from the outside. Not Do-hyun's world, specifically, the dead man switch was insurance, not a mission, and she had no interest in becoming a federal informant or an instrument of any institution's agenda. But the general architecture of financial crime, the specific mechanics of how it operated, she understood it with the intimacy of someone who had built portions of it with her own hands, and that understanding was worth something. She was going to build something legitimate with it. Something that used what she knew to do, what she'd originally trained to do, before David Holt disappeared and 2 men in suits appeared at her apartment door. Financial investigation, exposure of fraud, protection of people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to protect themselves from systems designed to extract from them. She would need a new name on the consultancy paperwork. She had one. She would need to establish slowly, carefully, in a way that did not create a traceable thread back to Zariah Monroe or the penthouse or any of it. She had a plan for that too. She would need time, which was the one thing she now had in a quantity that felt, after 3 years of captivity and 3 weeks of running, almost incomprehensible. She had time. She sat up and went to the desk and opened the secondary device and pulled up the blank document she'd created on the plane, the one with the consultancy structure she'd been mapping. She sat in the chair with the city outside the window going about its morning, and she began to write. Not numbers this time. Words, a name for the entity she was building, a structure for what it would do, a set of principles for how it would operate. She wrote for an hour without stopping. When she paused and read back what she had written, she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has started a thing that is genuinely theirs, built on ground that belongs to them, accountable to no one but their own judgment. She reached for the secondary device and opened the countdown and reset it for the 43rd time since Chicago. 17 hours, 51 minutes to the next cycle. She would reset it tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days after that it took for the agreement to hold long enough that the holding became the natural state of things rather than the enforced one. She had no particular anger about this. The dead man's switch was a structure, and structures were how you managed reality when reality required management. She was very good at structures. She closed the countdown screen and put the device down and turned back to the document on the desk. The city outside the window moved through its morning, without her, indifferent and full, and entirely unknowing. And inside the fourth floor room, who had once been told she was nothing, built the first sentence of a company that existed to undo exactly the kind of harm that had once been done to her. And the sentence was clean and specific and completely her own. She wrote it. She kept going. The light through the window changed as morning became afternoon, and she did not stop writing. And the document grew, and the city went on outside, and somewhere from the other side of an ocean, in a waterfront estate, in a Pacific storm's aftermath, a man she had once loved and had decided not to carry was rebuilding what she had left him of his empire, and neither of them looked back, because looking back was not the same as remembering, and remembering was not the same as being trapped. Found day. Zariah Monroe, who had spent 3 years learning the difference between those things at considerable cost, had finally arrived somewhere that the difference did not matter anymore. She was the only person in the room. The room was hers. She closed the consultancy document, saved it under a name only she knew, and opened a clean ledger on the screen, the first one belonging entirely to her own work, her own company, her own future. She wrote the first number. It felt, she thought, like the first true thing she had written in 3 years. Kept her eyes on the screen and her hands on the keys, and outside the window the afternoon light moved across the city she was learning to live in, and the dead man's switch counted down, and the new ledger filled, line by line, with numbers that added up to something she had not had a word for until she was sitting in a bare room on the other side of the world, with nobody watching her and nothing to protect except the work itself. Freedom, she thought, did not feel like she had expected it to feel. It felt quieter. It felt like this: a desk, a screen, a window, a city that did not know her name. It felt like enough. She wrote the second number. She did not stop.